Okay. So let me formulate the question in another way. So I can see most of you wrote results. Some of you wrote also results and discussion. But to talk about the materials is very important, because how the methodology was formulated, the results were based on how the methodology was formulated. So it's very important also to use the methodology when you are quoting or when you are citing a paper. Now, discussion is a tricky point. Discussion is a tricky point because it depends on what you take from the discussion. If you take the author's opinion from the discussion, then that's okay. But if you cite other research that the author is using in his research, then here you might be subjected to bias. Let me give you an example another way. So, for example, this author, so for example, let's say Hamid, writes about a certain point, and he is writing about this point, quoting or citing someone else. Okay? For example, he's citing Thomas. And what you do is, in your paper, you start writing or citing that Hamid said, that Thomas said, etc., etc. Now, you did not go back and read what Thomas said actually in his paper, because each of us, so for example, Hamid might be using two techniques of the paper of Thomas, but Thomas might have had 5 or 6 techniques in his paper. If I as Rania go and cite Hamid's paper and Thomas's paper based on what Hamid wrote, then this means I am being biased. Is that clear? It is very important, and this is the difference between a primary citation and a secondary citation. A secondary citation should be avoided, so you should avoid taking a reference in a reference as your reference, unless you go back and read that reference. Because again, our individual interpretations as the researchers of each research or of each article might be different, not only because our critical views are different, but because our objectives in our researchers might be different. So my objective in my research might be technique 1 and technique 2, while somebody else's research might be technique 3 and technique 4. It's not incorrect, but what's incorrect is that I simply cite from the discussion a paper that is not that I did not directly read, and then say I will rely on this data. Is that clear? Okay. Okay, so the other thing is to be objective. So again, how do you prevent to do this? An important thing also is, you see at the end here, in citation bias or negligence, is incorrect statistical analysis. We've all studied biostatistics, of course. It's very important that you look at statistical analysis. One point that I have found over the years that helps a lot with critiquing articles is not only to rely on what is written in the text, but actually to criticize tables, bar charts, graphs, images, figure legends. If you don't already do that, you must do that. If you look at, because what we write, again, as an author or as a researcher on about the conclusion of your research is, again, partly my interpretation. But I might be looking, for example, I might be writing a sentence to say, for example, drug A was had statistically significantly higher results than drug B. But then when I go and look at the graph, now this is part of critiquing a paper, but then when I go and look at the graph, I find, for example, it's a bar chart, and I find that the standard deviation on the bars is very high. And then that makes me question. If the standard deviation is high, that means that the variation between the means was a lot, which means that technically there might have been, this experiment was not so accurate. Now, you expect a standard deviation to be high in experimental animal work because of the individual variations or human clinical trials, but not, for example, in vitro work. And this, again, helps you to critique the work. You might be saying there is statistically significant difference between two conditions, but the actual difference between them, if you look, for example, is like 2 or 3-fold, not 10 to 20-fold as you feel is implied from the writing. So it's very important that you analyze each and every part of the paper that you are critiquing. So again, be objective, critically evaluate, avoid selection bias, and minimize self-citation. So we talked about self-citation. We said we should avoid citing ourselves, and we should, again, this is what I was talking about before, you must read what you cite. You should not cite something that you have not read, and you have to be clear and concise, and of course, check statistics. Okay, so this is one example of publication bias. And unfortunately, I have been subjected to this kind of to this type of reviewer before. So when you send your work for revision, and it's usually, of course, a blinded review, you might have a reviewer who asks you to add some citations. So, for example, he tells you in this part you failed to reference John and Jack and Darla in these papers. All right. Now, if many times, of course, the reviewer is correct, and he might bring to your attention a paper, for example, that you had overlooked, and then in that point, it's okay. But sometimes, and this happened with me more than once, that a reviewer asks you to cite papers that, for example, 2 or 3 papers, in which one of the authors is the same in each of the 3 papers, and you fail to see the true or the real relationship of this paper. So it's, of course, related in some way or the other to your work, of course, because this reviewer, of course, will be in your area of specialty. But you don't think it's 100% important to write these papers. And when you start digging, you can discover that this reviewer is actually requesting your citation of his work. Now, why would a reviewer do that? To increase citation counts or to enhance visibility. And these cases sometimes have been raised with the Committee of Publication Ethics. And in these cases, these reviewers might be actually reprimanded or punished by the editor-in-chief by not being reviewers anymore. But it happens. So be careful when you are reading reviewers' comments and analyze when they ask you to add citations, why they're asking you to add these citations. This is very, very important. Okay, improper authorship. I am sure in the research world, we have all faced the problem of authorship. And so let me give you an example. So this is the most common example or problem that faces particularly master or PhD students. So this example from this cartoon, I'm not interested in what the paper is about. Dr. Jones, I just want you to put me on the author's list. So this is a situation that happens. It, of course, puts you as a student in a critical political situation where you really don't know what to do. But now things are becoming much clearer because there are actually guidelines and rules for authorship. So this is quite easy to understand. Now, are you all clear with the? Do you know the rules for authorship? We can go through them very quickly if you like. But do you all know? Okay. If you enumerate another team to proceed to one of the tests of your experiment, for instance, a flow cytometry after behavior analysis, is it ethical not to or not, as they don't interpret nor critique the data. Include them in the author if it is only supportive information, as they are contractors. All right. Okay, so you're asking a very good question. Let's move forward into the authorship, then this will be very clear. All right. So the rules for authorship, there are 4 rules. Now, the criteria, so the International Committee, it's very important for you. If you go into the website for the International Committee for Medical Journal Editors, you will find that a lot of things related to authorship and to publication are clear on this website. Now, there are requirements for authorship. Now, the rules for the MJE are that an author must have contributed to at least one aspect of each of the following 4 criteria. Any individual that who does not meet the criteria may be mentioned in the acknowledgement section of the manuscript. Now, let me clarify one thing. If someone is being offered money, or if someone is being paid to do part of this experiment, then automatically this person is not an author. They are doing this as technical work as part of their technical job. So they should not be placed in the authorship. Now, let's read them together, these 4 criteria. Remember that each author must have contributed to at least one item of these 4 criteria. Number 1, either substantially contributed to conception or design, or contributed to acquisition, analysis, or interpretation of the data. Either of both. Number 2, drafted the manuscript or critically revised the manuscript for important intellectual content. So in 1 and 2, you have the options from the right and the left columns. But for 3, you have to give the final approval. And for 4, you have to agree to be accountable for all aspects of the work in ensuring that questions relating to the accuracy or integrity of any part of the work are appropriately investigated and resolved. By the way, most of the journals will require you to sign an author declaration form, which says that all of these authors have read, have contributed substantially, and agree to be accountable for the work. For a simple reason, you might publish this work, and someone another author from another journal might write you a comment and say, I don't think that this data is accurate for the experiment number 1 or number 2. And one of your authors might say, oh, it's not my problem. I didn't do this. No, I'm sorry. As an author, you agreed, when you submitted to the journal, the paper, you agreed to be accountable for all aspects. This is the author declaration form. Now, in response to your question, Jean, if this person is going to be doing this part of the experiment as a contractor, someone who is being paid money for it, then they should not be placed as authors. Now, if they are not taking money for it, but are only doing that part of the work and will not be involved in either interpretation or in documentation of so you see, if they doesn't fulfill the rest of the criteria, then he remains to be in the acknowledgement section. However, the ethical thing to do is to ask this person conducting the flow cytometry work whether or not he or she wants to be involved in the paper. If he or she responds that they want to be involved in the paper, then they must fulfill the rest of the criteria. They must contribute to other parts of the work, contribute to writing of the manuscript, and of course, give the final approval and agree to be accountable. Okay? Is that clear? All right. Now, another important thing, and some of you who have been involved in the area of publication is, for example, if 2 groups are. So first of all, let me clarify. Do you know who should be the first author, who should be the second author, who should be the third author, etc.? Do you have an idea about that? Everyone knows? Okay. So usually, because many times this is a misconception for some people. Some people believe that okay, so how it goes in in original scientific research or research where there is experimentation. So you have the first author, you have the last author, and you have co-authors in the middle. And by the way, there can be no limits unless the journal asks you to limit the number of authors. So some journals require 4 authors only, 6 authors only. Some journals do not have a maximum number of authors. Again, there is no maximum as long as each person has contributed. So for example, you must have all noticed that articles published, for example, in Nature and Science may sometimes have many authors, or for example, journals such as PLOS ONE, you will find that you have a lot of authors. If each of these authors has contributed, you know, one important thing of how to know the contribution of the author, if you are in a group, is to see who contributed to how many number of figures and graphs. So for example, if you have 8 figures and tables in the paper, I contributed to 3. Somebody else contributed to 2. Somebody else contributed to 1. And I drafted the manuscript. So I'm the person who did most of the work, okay? And drafted the manuscript. So this means I'm the first author. Now, in the area of biomedical research, most of the times, or more than 90% of the time, the first author is the student. So either the master's student or the PhD student, or sometimes the postdoc immediate after he or she finished the PhD. The last author is usually the head of the group, the person who is responsible for conception of ideas, for funding of the research group, for delegation of the different research points to all of the teams, for cooperating with other teams, with other research groups or other universities, for you to be able to perform a joint work. He is the last author. And remember, most of the time people fight about the position of the last author. Now, in between, in the middle, are all of the co-authors. So author number 1 and the last author are the most important, okay? Now, who comes next? The second author. The second author is usually, so for example, if you are a PhD student, your second author is your postdoc who was helping you with all of the research and did some of the experimental work with you, or interpreted and did some of the data analysis with you. You are the 2 people who are brainstorming at 9 p.m. in the evening, trying to understand the data. So this is the second author. Sometimes you will see something called equally contributing authors. So you see a mark or a label or an asterisk on the first author and the second author, the same. What is an equally contributing author? An equally contributing author is if me and, for example, Jean have performed exactly equivalent amount of work. We are both writing the manuscript together. We are sharing in the information together. We are drafting the manuscript together, etc. So this means we can be equally contributing authors. It's okay. And then you have the last author. So let's say my boss is collaborating with another lab, for example, in Sweden. And I went to Sweden to do part of the work. But the main group is my group, for example, in Egypt. But the head of the Swedish group also wants to be in the paper. So in order to give appropriate contributorship to the author, to the head of the group in Sweden, what you can do is the head of the group in Sweden will be before last. So the last name will be my head, the before the last will be the Swedish group head, I will be the first author, and my colleague who did most of the work will be the second author. Everyone else in the middle really are interchangeable, because it might be, for example, the person who did the statistical analysis and interpretation, the person who only did the experimental animal work and documented that part, so had a small part in the contribution, etc. Okay, you, for example, need to use a CT scan, for example, or a CT machine, and it's not available except in a certain place, and the person there helped you to do the analysis because it's not your area of expertise. So we helped you to do the analysis and wrote that part. So again, they will be in the middle. You will see many of your colleagues who have now, for example, reached the point of being postdocs. In your curriculum, in your CV, the best path in your career should be, first, in your first years when you are a student, you are the first author. If you're lucky, you are the first author in many papers, but at least 2-3 papers, okay? Then you finish your PhD and you start as a postdoc. You are still doing most of the work, so you again might be a first author. And then you start supervising PhD students, and so you shift to the position number 2. And then over the next couple of years, you start building your small group. Hopefully you get a grant, and then you start funding your research group, and then you move to becoming the last author. This should be the most perfect track in your CV over 10 years of research life. All right? Is that clear? Is it clear how authorship works? Remember, you should not be putting any person who did not contribute sufficiently to the work as an author. You should be sure that they justified all of the criteria. So if you ask me the question, what if a professor who has nothing to do with the work asks me to be added in the work? What should I do? The wonderful thing now in many journals is that they ask you to write the contributorship of each author. I don't know if you noticed it, but at the end of many papers, you will see a very small paragraph at the end with the initials of the author. So for example, I will be Rania Al-Bakli, so I will be RB. And you will see RB, colon, RB contributed to the rabbit work, experimental design, and the drafting of the manuscript, and blah, 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 blah. And for example, and then following, comma, Ayub contributed to statistical interpretation of the flow cytometry work. Many journals will ask you specifically who did what. This is partially to protect themselves so that nobody goes back after they publish the work and says, hey, I contributed to this and this and this and nobody wrote my name. No, I'm sorry, everyone signed and the contributorship of everyone is clear. This is an example of an author declaration form that could be in the form of a printed paper, or it could be also in the form of an electronic signature. And it is usually required by most of the respected journals. And if you look at the author declaration form, you will find that it has many of the parts of ethics. We sign below declare that the submitted manuscript is original, has not been published before, and is not being considered for publication elsewhere. We confirm we have no conflict of interest. There has not been significant financial support, that we have not caused any bias. And we confirm we have followed the regulations of our institutions in concerning, you can see here, intellectual property rights. We also declare and confirm the work covered in the manuscript has involved either experimental element. You see, you've done it only after receiving a relevant institutional ethics committee. We understand that the corresponding author. Okay, we didn't talk about the corresponding author. One of the authors in this list of authors is called the corresponding author. Now, the corresponding author usually is either the first author or the last author, but he or she can be anyone in the authors. The important thing about the corresponding author is that this is the person whose email address will be the email address responsible for all communication with the other authors and communication with the journal, with the editorial board, in order to perform all of the editing process of the journal, of the paper. So the corresponding author should be one of the people who knows most about the work to be able to answer questions. the corresponding author is also an author who has a lot of responsibility, because his email will be there when the final paper is published. And anyone who wants to ask something in the paper will send an email, like, for example, I'm sure most of you have done that, will send an email inquiring about something in the paper to this author. Now, if the corresponding author doesn't know what he's talking about, then that's, of course, a very bad point for our credibility. Something that I want to draw your attention to is the first sentence. We declare that the submitted manuscript is original, has not been published before, and is not being considered for publication elsewhere. Now, I am sure you all know this information, but let me be sure. Now, you can see from the author declaration form that you sign a form that says you did not publish somewhere else. Okay, so let me ask you this question. If you have submitted your article, your manuscript, it's called a manuscript until it is published online. If you have submitted your manuscript to the journal, and this journal has not replied to you for 4 months, and you have to get your PhD degree or your master's degree, and you cannot get it except if you publish this paper, do you think it's okay to change the title of the paper and submit it to another journal while you are still waiting for a response from the first journal? Very good. Excellent. So we agree. You either, now the options that you have are, by the way, you must wait, this is number one, or you can retract your articles. This is one option that you have as an author. After you submit, you can retract the article or the manuscript to be able to submit it to somewhere else. If you simply modify the title and change a little bit in the wording of the manuscript, but the data is the same, then this is a form of plagiarism. Okay, this is very, very important. I'm glad that everyone is clear about this. Okay, so here we enter into the area of plagiarism, and I'm sure you're all clear about this. So a couple of funny examples. What do you mean? I all my facts are wrong. I copied everything straight off the internet. It's all original research. I had no assistance when I looked it up on Wikipedia. And of course, these are very simple examples of plagiarism. Now, I am sure you understand what plagiarism is. So this means that you are taking wording or information from a paper or an article without appropriately citing it. So you don't write it in the reference list, and you don't paraphrase. The correct thing to do when you are writing or when you are citing someone is to cite the work in your own words. Now, I'm sure you all know this, so let me just highlight two important things: self-plagiarism and publication rights. Do you know what self-plagiarism is? How can you plagiarize yourself? So for those of you who do not know, self-plagiarism is, now remember one thing: once you have published an article, it is no longer yours. You can ask me how. I am the author. It's mine. No, it is not yours, because you sign something called a copyright permission form, where you are transferring your copyright as an author to the journal once the work is published. And so if you publish a paper, so for example, if Larousse, I'm not sure if I pronounce correctly, but if Larousse published a paper and Miriam, so if Miriam published a paper and Miriam is now writing another paper that is related to somehow the work that she did in the first paper, and Miriam says, hey, it's my work, And so she copies part of the first paper. So I go tell Mariam, you cannot do that. This is plagiarism. And Mariam tells me, no, but this is my work. I'm the one who wrote it. Yes, but it is no longer yours. Once you have given the copyright to the journal, it is no longer yours. Now, let me ask you another question. If you are writing a chapter in a book, or you are writing the review of literature in your thesis, or in a paper, and you want to take as a reference a diagram or an illustration published in another paper, what do you do? Excellent. All right. So to clarify this point, I think some of you maybe have an idea about it and some don't. So okay, you'll see. So there are two things that need to be done. First of all, 100%, you must reference it. Okay. So you must reference it. Many people reference it underneath the caption or the legend of the diagram itself. They put it in between brackets and they say, if you've seen it before, copyrighted from, etc. And sometimes if it is, for example, in our field, if it is clinical cases, clinical images of cases, you can ask the author and you write courtesy of Dr., I don't know, John West or whatever. But if this diagram or photo or clinical image or figure has been published in a journal or in a book, you must ask for permission. Write copyright permission. So in most of respectable journals and books or publishers, they have a copyright permission or a permission form that you can send. So you send and you ask them, I would like to obtain permission to reproduce this data, and then they offer you either permission to do that or not. Even again, if it is your own graph originally to start with as an author. Okay? So this is very important because although many of us might know what avoiding plagiarism is, some people forget about the diagrams and the figures. Okay, so let's move to the last, going towards the a little bit further. So of course you are aware of cross-reference or similarity check or authenticate. This is of course software that is used to check for plagiarism. Most of the professional high caliber journals use authenticate. Most of the journals will not accept more than 20% of the plagiarism or similarity. And of course, you must know that sometimes it is impossible to avoid similarity, for example, in sections such as the methodology section or the names or the equations, compositions of chemicals, etc. So there is a limit that is, of course, acceptable. They usually do not check the areas of the materials and methods, and of course not the results, because the results cannot be plagiarized. It's impossible. But mainly if there is some plagiarized data, it will be either in the intro section or in the discussion section. This is the copyright permission, how to obtain permission. So you get a license from the copyright owner. Fraud and inaccuracy. Let me give you examples of fraud in science. Unfortunately, there have been many examples of fraud in science. I'm not sure if you remember this. In 2006, Woo-Suk Wang, he published, he published in 2004 and 2005, two very important papers in the journal Science, and he promised that he would provide an endless supply of stem cells genetically matched to patients. Unfortunately, what happened is that he had embezzled money, and he had violated ethics, and he had falsified the data, and he was incapable of doing that. The problem is with fraud in science. So this is an example of misconduct. The problem is unfortunately, the law or the legal system does not prevent these people from performing science ever in their lives. Of course, he has been damned by the scientific community. However, I have read recently that he has now been able to rejoin, starting to research again. So this is a big problem, because people like this should actually have a legal kind of punishment. But unless he was legally accused of embezzlement, fraud in science doesn't have such, how do you say, such strong punishments, and that's the problem. Yes, of course, he has been damned in the scientific community, but I don't think, in my opinion, this is enough. Another very important example, I don't know if you've heard of this example, it was very, very recent. It was in 2014, and Haruko Obokata, she was the PhD student underneath the director Yoshiki Sasai. And what they did was that they published a very important article in Nature. They published actually two papers in Nature, where they claimed that they were able, using stimuli, by applying stress or chemical conditions on different cells or differentiated cells, they were able to reprogram them and give them pluripotency rather than use different genes as was before. And what was discovered is, now this is very interesting, this story, is that how was the fraud discovered? When people publish in journals such as Science and Nature, a very important part of the ethical conduct of research is reproducibility of data. If you are honest and accurate in conducting your scientific experiment, then this data should be reproducible in any part of the world if you use the same methodology. And what happened is, when other important groups working in the field of regenerative medicine started to try to reproduce these data in different labs, they could not. And so they sent to the journal. And when the journal started to investigate, they discovered that the data was falsified. And they retracted the paper. Of course, having a paper retracted is a very, very bad thing for the credibility of any scientist. And what Yoshiki Sasai discovered was that that his PhD student, because she was afraid, she was under a lot of stress, she actually falsified the data. And because Yoshiki Sasai was such an important person, and he took it really hard on his scientific career and on his morals, he actually committed suicide. So as you can see, fraud in science can have very bad consequences, and of course it is damning to the future of a scientist. Now, one other issue is conflict of interest. And what is conflict of interest? This is a simple thing. This is a simple statement that you are all asked to sign at the end of a journal. And conflict of interest could be funding. So it's very important that I must declare conflict of interest. So for example, if I have a company who is funding my research, I must declare that this company has funded my research. Why? Does it mean I shouldn't do the research? No, because many of us in the research community are looking for people to fund our research. But it is important to acknowledge that this company funded, just to be clear and transparent with the other readers and researchers who are reading this research, that having had the fund might have influenced the data in any way. It should not, but it is a kind of transparency. I should not have any personal conflict of interest. So for example, I should not be trying to push the publication of this data simply because I want more recognition, I want this hot topic to be published. This again is a conflict of interest. Okay. Of course, at the end, we have to remember that ethics is a shared responsibility. It is our responsibility. It is the responsibility of our institutions. It is the responsibility of our journals. It is the responsibility of editors and referees as well. So a very important point of referees or reviewers. So I'm sure some of you are already reviewers in international journals, or soon you will be. It's very, very important. You know, being a referee or a reviewer for an international journal is usually a volunteer job that you do not, 99% of the time, you take no money for it. But because it is a very important responsibility, referees and reviewers must be extremely meticulous and accurate, because we have a responsibility about ethical distribution of this knowledge. Okay, so I'm now towards the end of this brief discussion, and I want to ask you if you have any questions before finalizing. I'll give you the two examples. Maybe we can discuss them. We have a few minutes left. We can discuss them a bit together if you like. If not, I can leave it up to you. Do you have any questions? Do you have any areas that you don't think we have covered? All right. What are the conditions to be a reviewer? Okay. Okay. So, Amina, once you have published an international article in a well-known journal, many journals are actually underneath the umbrella of common publishers. So, for example, a publisher such as Science Direct, or such as Elsevier, publishes underneath many journals. And what happens is when you become an author and publish with, for example, one of these publishers, and of course there is a big database, of course there is Web of Science and Scopus, you are immediately cited or seen on these web pages. So you are seen on these databases, on Science, on Scopus, etc. And you create what is called a researcher ID and an ORCID number or an ORCID number, and you have a Google Scholar account. You begin to get an H index. And once you get into the network, there are two ways to become a reviewer. Either you apply to become a reviewer for a specific journal, but honestly, what mostly happens is once you become an author who is known, the journals themselves will send you invitations asking you to be a reviewer. Now, being a reviewer, again, is a very important thing. Usually, being a reviewer means you select. So when you are invited to be a reviewer, you write the area of specialty in which you want the papers to be sent to you. So my specialty, for example, is regenerative endodontics, bone engineering. And what happens is that the journal will send me papers to revise only within the area of my specialty. Ethics, research ethics, for me means that if I feel that the paper is not within my area of expertise, to be honest and say, I'm sorry, I decline to review it because it is not my area of expertise. The other important thing to be a reviewer is to be blinded. So 90% of the times will be sent the paper and you do not know who the authors are, so that you are able to perform an unbiased revision of the work. Being a reviewer is as something that takes experience and trial and error, and you will learn as you go ahead. So hurry up and publish so that you get to be in the network. There is also now a community called Publons. I don't know if you've seen it. So Publons is an international network which tracks reviews. So this network, Publons, is linked to many publishers. And once you submit a review, because you do this online, of course, once you submit a review, Publons will ask you, would you like to take credit for this review? And you will say yes or no or whatever. And this means that you are now more acknowledged as an international reviewer. And the more years that pass, you will find that other journals will communicate with you, etc., to become a reviewer. The international database of reviewers, of course, for any specific topic is huge. There are thousands and thousands and thousands of reviewers. It is a time-consuming job, but it is very good for your CV. All right. Please ask me if you have any other questions, any other points that you would like to add, anything that was not clear. All right. So just to go over the discussing cases of misconduct, these are the two cases that I want you to assess as an individual task. And then I sent you the critique articles where you are going to work as groups. So let's read the cases together. Case number 1, Sally emigrated from China to pursue a research career in the United States. Her understanding of English is excellent, but she still finds it difficult to write papers in any language other than Mandarin. She's doing a federally funded postdoctoral fellowship in a health psychology lab. Her research focuses on behavioral interventions aimed at reducing obesity. As she writes up the results of her study, she finds 2 articles that are relevant: a systematic review article on the same subject and a study done by someone in her lab 2 years earlier. She borrows text extensively from both articles without citing them and then submits her paper for publication. What do you think of Sally's behavior? How do you think the authorities should act? So tell me what you think of the example. Is the example clear? Oh, you didn't see the, sorry. Okay. Did I read them too fast? Here you go. Okay. Did you see the example or not? The example was on the screen. It's okay? All right. Oh, no. Oh, okay. No, okay. No, okay. Oh, because I can't see you texting and have the screen at the same time. I'll send you the examples. But I think I sent them to you before, right? Or no? It's okay. I'll post them. I'll post them in you'll see them in the presentation. Okay, okay. You'll see them in the presentation. I'll show them to you. It's okay. Let me just remind you that when you look at the example, so again, this is the example. Remember that it might seem that the case might seem to be simply talking about plagiarism, but I want you to remember also one important thing when you are citing papers. You cannot cite papers from another language. So unless this is your native language. So for example, you cannot cite a Russian paper or a paper written in the Russian language because of course you did not read the paper. So that's a very important thing. Now, having good command of language, of course, particularly the English language, since most of scientific articles are written in English, is a very important thing. So you will see when you analyze the case that the problem starts higher up, starts from the beginning, because even though she understands English correctly, she still cannot write, which means that from the beginning, she should have appropriate training. So I will leave you to discuss the case together, even if you want, and then perform individual assessment of what you think about the paper. Okay, so this is case number 2. William has run a successful lab for years. He is surprised one day to find out he is being investigated for data fabrication. For many years, he and others in his lab dropped outliers and made up values when they had missing data without reporting such activities in their manuscripts. He felt this just made it easier to get through peer review. It yielded clearer, stronger patterns, but never changed the basic conclusions of his research. An angry postdoctoral fellow, whom he fired for consistently sloppy work, reported him to the university's research integrity officer. William lost all of his research funding, his lab was closed, 3 staff members lost their jobs, and 2 doctoral students had to find new mentors and start new projects. And the questions are, what do you think of William's behavior? How does William's behavior impact the scientific community? And what do you think of the consequences? Did you have a chance to see this one? Okay, I'll post them now in the resources so that you can all see them and check them out. I want you to see them now. So if you have any questions, if there's something is not clear, we can discuss it in the couple of minutes remaining for us. Oh, okay. Okay, so I put the first case on. Can you please take a look? Okay, so I posted both. Okay, great. These are some of the resources. Again, they will be available for you. So there's some of the resources, for example, Retraction Watch, so that you can see some of the examples of case